It is not that long since the existence of the Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6 as it is better known, was never publicly acknowledged. I vividly remember the panic a few years back amongst the Prime Minister's aides when they saw that a seat had been reserved at a White House news conference with a card marked simply C, the code name for the service's chief, the equivalent of M in the Bond films or Control in John le Carré's Circus. C was not to be named, let alone seen or heard in public. However, today, for the first time, C joins us live here in the Today programme studio. Richard Moore is the man who now runs MI6. He's about to make his first major public speech since taking on the role just over a year ago. Richard Moore, C, good morning. Welcome to the Today programme.
Good morning.
I should ask you at the outset, why are you here, given that that is so obviously a break from the way that other Cs have behaved in the past?
Well, we have come a long way, and I well remember when I joined the service in the 1980s, absolutely the identity of C was not revealed, but we have moved on a bit, and I think in a modern democracy it is important that I, from time to time, judiciously come and share some thoughts on what my service does, the sort of challenges that we face, and indeed how we're going to need to change to meet those challenges.
Now, in your speech today, you talk of a paradox that you need to be open to be secret. How so? Why?
Well, it's a complicated issue. But if I talk a bit about what we do. What we do is to recruit and run secret agents overseas. And that's what I did as a young officer, and it's what we continue to do. And from those well-placed sources, we provide the intelligence which allows our leaders to try and navigate this contested, complex, difficult world. And if I look at how we do that in a world where increasingly governments have access to pretty comprehensive surveillance technologies, you can imagine, without me going into too much detail, that makes our life more difficult.
Crudely, if you ever wore a beard and moustache when you were skulking on the streets as a young agent, that's not really on anymore. That's not the world we now live in.
If that was ever the world we lived in, Nick, that is certainly not the world we live in now.
You did your fair share of skulking in streets at night.
I'm sure I did some skulking, perhaps not quite in the colourful image that you presented. But the serious point here is right. If we are faced with those sort of technological threats to our, if you like, business model, our way of going about doing our job, then we have to stay ahead of that curve. And we have traditionally done an awful lot in-house, but increasingly we're going to have to, I think, work with the tech sector to be able to tap into their extraordinary abilities. And in order to do that, we're just going to have to be a bit more open, I think, about who we are.
Open to working with new people, but open to recruiting new people is the era of what I imagine you had, the tap on the shoulder at Oxbridge College. Is that over for MI6 in the way you get your staff?
It is over. We still take personal recommendations. It's always useful to have people recommended, but clearly there are risks that you tap on the shoulder people who look like you, and it's very important that we get out there and try and recruit from all sections of society. Nowadays, people apply, via the website, and then we take care to keep their identity secure as they go through that process.
Is it also a reflection, though, that without falling for the caricature of the man in the beard, but that a modern agent in the Secret Intelligence Service might be an extraordinarily clever guy or girl sitting in front of one of these screens rather than being out in the dark on a street?
Well, we have to be careful about our terminology, and sorry to be precise on this, but of course when we talk about agents, we talk about the brave men and women overseas who work with us, who cast their lot with us and work with us. The officers in MI6 have got to do a range of activity. They are still, of course, overseas. They are still doing the work, which can sometimes be dangerous and lonely. But of course, also they are working through data, targeting and doing all that stuff back at home.
Now, you say in the speech you're delivering this morning that our adversaries are pouring money and ambition into AI, into quantum computing and synthetic biology. I understand why that might be a real deep cause of concern for the Treasury, for the people running the business department, for the Foreign Office, Britain's status in the world. Why for our secret intelligence service? Is it a fear that MI6, in the lead for so long, might be left behind?
Well, it's a more general point, I think, that in the contest for influence and power through the 21st century, those who command the key technologies will have an advantage. So it's really important that we in the West keep up and that we are able to innovate to keep up. I'm not at all downcast about that. I think the UK has a lot of advantages in this space. We've got a great science and tech sector, and I think the West as a whole has advantages because we do have free societies. We do have an ability to get the entrepreneurial animal spirits going in a way that perhaps authoritarian regimes don't.
I understand why it's important, because we want to be prosperous as a nation.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it important in terms of national security, though? Because we tend to think of threats as sort of troops or tanks amassed at a border, perhaps agents coming to our country with poison to murder an adversary on our soil. You're talking about something different, though. Can you spell out what that threat is?
Yeah, let me do my best to do that. I would describe often the way in which China goes about, for example, its work around developing AI. In particular, it is trying to harvest data from around the world. And it's also trying to use influence through its economic policies to try and sometimes, I think, get people on the hook. I talk about data traps and debt traps in this space. And then they will use them for leverage.
Data and debt. Just spell that out if you would.
So I think a debt trap is something I think we're all fairly familiar with, that if you take on loans and then you find it difficult to repay them, then, we've seen some examples of this where the Chinese have then been able to acquire significant ports, which have the potential to become naval facilities, etc. The data trap is this, that if you allow another country to gain access to really critical data about your society, over time, that will erode your sovereignty. You no longer have control over that data. That's something which I think in the UK we are very alive to, and we've taken measures to defend against. It's not true, I think, in all the conversations I have around the globe, and I'm very keen that people should understand that.
Is this a reflection not just that technology is changing and China's economic prowess is changing, but the ambitions of China, in particular President Xi, a man on the brink of being and having the same status as Chairman Mao? What are your agents telling you? What is intelligence telling you of the ambition of China?
Well, what I would say on this, I don't think, to be honest, that you necessarily need secret agents to tell you this. President Xi is very clear that that we are now in a more assertive stage with China. China has expectations of its role in the international community, and some of that is perfectly legitimate, Nick. But it's also the case that China is controlled by an authoritarian regime. They don't share our values, and often their interests clash with ours. And so I think, what I'm saying here is that we need to be very robust in fighting our corner. This is not advocating a kind of adversarial relationship with China at all. It's really important that we cooperate with China on some of the key transnational threats we face: climate change, biodiversity. But where we need to compete, we should.
For the Secret Intelligence Service means what? Is it about you being able to find what is being discussed in private rather than stated in public, to warn allies, to warn corporations, to warn individuals perhaps? Look, this is what they're really up to.
The essential element of our job is to try and increase understanding of the threats that we face, and therefore enable our leaders to manage those threats. And
that's the threat of our generation, of our future.
Of course, and that includes, of course, the key technologies and where potential adversaries are in terms of acquiring those technologies.
Now, perhaps the more immediate threat is the threat posed by President Putin and Russia. The president of Ukraine has warned of a coup on the 1st of December. That is tomorrow, of course. Do you believe that there is a real risk of Russian intervention, if not perhaps in that way, some way and soon?
I think we have a chronic problem around Ukraine, and it's a chronic problem because President Putin doesn't really accept the right of Ukraine to exist as an independent country. As you know, he's gone on record to say that the sort of collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And I think there are many people who might think that there were other greater catastrophes, and particularly if you live in Eastern Europe, you would hold that view. So he has long held that. And from time to time, we get sort of crises around Ukraine as we worry about build-up of troops and what President Putin's intentions might be. And therefore, it bears very careful watching, and it bears very careful signalling to the Russians about, the price that they would have to pay if they intervened, as they did in 2014. And at the same time, frankly, being very, very clear that there's not an adversarial sort of agenda here. We're not trying to encircle Russia. We're not trying to prevent it from pursuing its legitimate interests.
You're being careful with your words, and rightly so. Your words will be listened to carefully. You're a former ambassador as well. But are you telling us that it is an acute moment of risk in our relationship with Russia at the moment?
The integrated review on national security policy describes Russia as the acute threat. And that has to be the case. This is a power which just 3 years ago decided to use nerve agents on the streets of Salisbury. In 2014, it occupied whole areas of the Ukraine and annexed the Crimea. So, yes, of course, it is.
You will know that as some people are listening to you, you'll say, these intelligence guys, they don't always get it right, do they? And we don't have to think back to Iraq. There are plenty of people thinking of Afghanistan. Was it the case that our intelligence was wrong about the ability of the Afghan army and the Afghan government to survive? Or are there some people who might think that's a rather convenient excuse for decisions they took?
The assessment was clearly wrong. None of us predicted the speed of the fall of Kabul. But I think it is really overblown to describe it in terms of intelligence failure or something of this kind. Frankly, Nick, if we had recruited every member of the Taliban Shura, the leadership group of the Taliban, if we recruited every one of them as a secret agent, we still wouldn't have predicted the fall of Kabul, because the Taliban didn't. So, I think one has to be careful in making the judgments about culpability in terms of where we came to on that situation.
What about the assessment of the threat posed by the fall of the Afghan government when your opposite number, the head of MI5, was in that very chair? He was able to say to us, A, there are many more threats now, and B, we at MI5 have managed to frustrate them. Do you think the threat is higher? And what's the role of MI6 rather than MI5 in dealing with those threats?
Well, the victory of the Taliban is a serious reverse for us. There's no soft-soaping that. I think in the immediate term, the threat from al-Qaeda and Daesh or ISIL in Afghanistan is probably limited because we are working off the legacy of 20 years of suppressing that threat. But the concern, of course, is twofold. One is that the victory of the Taliban would be a kind of rallying cry, would be a morale boost for extremists around the world, and indeed for those sitting in the capitals in Beijing, Tehran and Moscow. But over time, the worry is that al-Qaeda will rebuild the type of terrorist infrastructure that we saw in the run-up to 9/11. And we in MI6 are absolutely determined with our allies to make sure that doesn't happen.
Now, you talked about the fact that you want to be open to tech. You want the very best people in your Q division, and you really do have one. It's not just in the Bond movie. You want to work with companies too. There may be some listening to that and think, I know what this means. The security services want to get hold of our data. They want to put their interests ahead of our privacy. Can you reassure them?
I think so, because the difference between us and the Chinese intelligence services is we have to act within the law, and we have to absolutely respect UK law. So, where privacy is protected within the UK law, we absolutely have to adhere to it. So I think it's very, very different. What I'm talking about here is saying, given the challenges to the way in which we go about recruiting and running secret agents, if you look at some of the technology that is available to authoritarian regimes around, so-called smart cities, technology, surveillance, etc., then clearly in order to stay ahead of that, we can't do all of this in-house. As you say, we can't do it in our Q labs. The boffins behind the wire type model doesn't work for us anymore. So we need to partner in a different way with industry. We need to be in there, in Silicon Glen, in amongst the UK tech sector, having open conversations. You can't wait for 18 months to security vet somebody before you're prepared to open a conversation. People in the tech sector come into business, make their billion, and go out of business in 18 months. That's about the time we might get around to security clearing them. So clearly we have to move that model.
And what is the consequence if we don't? What are you warning people of in terms of the threat to the country, not simply to MI6's operating model, if we're too slow on this, if we get this wrong?
Well, I just don't think we will be. I mean, you
say you deal with the world as it is rather than the world as you wish it to be.
Yeah.
I think for people to take this seriously, they need to know, in a sense, don't they, what could go wrong? How would we know the world was a worse place if we didn't listen to you?
Look, I will come back to the fact that my organisation this is in our DNA. We have done this since the early part of the 20th century in terms of wonderful secret writing techniques. We did it in terms of running agents in MI6 and also in SOE during the war. This is absolutely a challenge we will rise to. So I'm confident we will get there. And as a society, as I said earlier on, I'm also confident that we will have the entrepreneurism to get there as well.
But for the country, to pick up your thought of the debt and data trap, the danger presumably is that people we think of as our allies feel trapped and unable to be our allies. And we have to help them out of those traps.
Well, I think we have to first and foremost get ahead of this and make sure people understand the potential traps here. And I spend quite a bit of my time going around talking to partners around the world, trying to get across some of these issues. Now, they can all, as we do, want to have a positive agenda with China. It's important that we trade with China. Trading is one of those positive elements in building trust between nations. And as I said, on the big transnational issues that are facing us, we need their cooperation. But at the same time, people shouldn't be naive about what the Chinese government is trying to do around our data. And I think the UK has hardened our defences quite considerably in this space with the National Cyber Security Centre and other innovations over the last few years.
Now, you actually openly acknowledge the James Bond heritage. You've chosen to call your tech division Q. You could have called it something else. You haven't renamed yourself M, I notice.
I have not.
Is it a burden around the neck of C, or is it something that is helpful?
Look, I think you've just got to celebrate it. It is fiction. It is not reality. But the Bond franchise is a wonderful one. I had such fun watching the most recent film. No spoilers here, but it's brilliant. It doffs a cap to all the great James Bond traditions.
No spoilers, but even at the end, did you have fun? Can you give us any reassurance about the future of 007?
I am just not going there because I find it difficult to avoid the spoilers. But no, we embraced James Bond, even though we know it is not true life.
Keeping secrets to the very end. See, the head of MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service. Thank you very much for coming in the Today programme studio this morning.
Thank you very much, Nick.
No pens you want to show us while you're here? Nothing exciting you can pull out of your pocket?
I have a slightly posher pen than this one, Michelle, but I'm afraid you've got the sort of plastic green pen.
But the colour is critical, isn't it?
It is. This is a tradition that dates back to the first C. Not standing for chief, by the way. Most people think that is. It stands for Cumming, as in Mansfield Cumming. He was a naval man and he wrote in green ink.
Green ink, and at the moment, anybody who gets a document with green ink on it in that building knows it comes from?
From me, and the same is true of my TypeScript on my computer.
Very good. OK, and if we follow you outside to your car, which obviously we're not going to do, but nothing terribly exciting on the car either.
Nothing, and I can assure you it is not, sadly, an Aston Martin.